At 10:20 p.m. on Tuesday, January 16th of 2024, New Hampshire Fish and Game officers received a call that a hiker was in distress near Mount Bond in Lincoln, New Hampshire. Concerned acquaintances had notified 911 that they had spoken to the hiker on his cell phone. The solo male hiker was identified as 37-year-old Christopher Roma of Thornton, New Hampshire. He was an experienced and well-known hiker who had vast hiking experience throughout New Hampshire and around the United States. Due to extreme winter conditions, it took rescuers until 5 o'clock the following afternoon to finally reach Roma, and when they got there, he had already perished. Today I'm going to take a look at the unfortunate death of Christopher Roma, the father of a 2-year-old son. Keep in mind that I'm not offering a diagnosis or an analysis of the individual. I'm only speculating about what might happen in circumstances like this. First, I'll give a brief description of the extreme weather conditions in the Mount Washington area where Christopher Roma was hiking that day. Then I'll take a look at the background of the story. I'll move to the rescue efforts that took place, as well as review some information not only from an interview I did with a New Hampshire Fish and Game officer, but in conversations with some individuals who were on trails at the same time that Chris Roma was hiking. And then I'll offer my analysis and some thoughts on how to potentially prevent a circumstance like this. Before I go any further on this video, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe and also to consider becoming a member of this channel to support the work that I'm doing here. Your subscription and membership means so much. I want to continue to bring you videos like this and do more analysis and situational stories about people who go into the wilderness, whether it's on the 8,000-meter peaks of Nepal and the Himalaya or right here in my home state of New Hampshire. The Mount Washington Valley area, as it's known, is home to what they call the world's worst weather. Chris Roma set out at 4 a.m. on the morning of January 16th with the hopes of completing the Pemi Loop, which is short for Pemigewasset Loop. This loop is 32 miles long, even under the most mild circumstances, warm weather with no snow on the ground. This 32-mile hike is considered a real test piece for hikers. This Pemi Loop is also part of what they call the Northeast Ultra 8 of what is believed to be the hardest hikes known in the Northeast. Chris Roma was endeavoring to complete the Northeast Ultra 8 in the wintertime. The Pemi Loop is within the White Mountain National Forest. Mount Washington, which is the deadliest mountain in the United States. Over 160 people have lost their lives on the mountain, many of them completely unprepared for the severe conditions that can take place up there, even on a beautiful summer day. It's known for having the worst weather in the world because it's at the confluence of 3 major storm tracks, allowing severe storms that regularly will hit it. And it's not unusual for winds to exceed 100 miles an hour on the summit with a lot of precipitation. And famously, the Mount Washington Observatory's weather station in 1934 recorded a wind speed of 231 miles an hour. That's the highest wind speed ever recorded by man. And now to the rescue efforts that commenced after the 911 call to New Hampshire Fish and Game. When New Hampshire Fish and Game officers first got the call, it was believed that Roma was in the vicinity of Mount Bond and headed toward another mountain nearby called Bond Cliff. Then Roma himself was able to reach 911 on his cell phone, wherein a more exact location could be identified of Roma. He was believed to be right near the summit of a mountain called Guyot. On this 32-mile hike, Roma still had 11 miles to go. He was endeavoring to complete the Pemi Loop in winter in about 16 hours, hoping to go about 2 miles an hour. He was going obviously much slower than he had originally anticipated. At the pace that he was going, and given the extreme snow and weather conditions, even a fit and warm hiker would possibly require probably an hour per mile, especially given the extreme weather. Before the 911 call dropped, Roma explained that he was very cold. A rescue had already gotten underway. The weather forecast in the area was for continued heavy winds, single-digit temperatures, and a lot more snow. Rescuers from the New Hampshire Fish and Game, the Pemi Valley Search and Rescue Team, and the Mountain Rescue Service met at Lincoln Woods, which is the parking lot where Roma had parked. By 2 a.m. on January 17th, now fully 22 hours after Roma had departed for his hike, the first rescuers started hiking in. The effort was slowed as the responders had to trudge through waist-deep snow, and once the rescuers were exposed above tree line, they were faced with brutal winds, heavy winds, blowing snow, and then they realized that since the progress was so slow, a call was made to New Hampshire Army National Guard to attempt a helicopter rescue of Chris Roma. Throughout the day, the New Hampshire Army National Guard attempted 3 different helicopter flights. Unfortunately, the visibility was very poor. There were high winds and lots of clouds. Throughout the day, the New Hampshire Army National Guard flew 3 separate flights to the Lincoln area, but could never get near Mount Gio because of low clouds and poor visibility. By early afternoon, ground crews still had not reached the subject. And then at 5 p.m., 2 of his friends finally reached Chris Roma, and unfortunately, Chris had already passed away. It was then decided that all the rescuers would come home for the night and return in the morning to recover the body. Ground teams from New Hampshire Fish and Game, Mountain Rescue Service, the Androscoggin Valley Search and Rescue Team, the Pemi Valley Search and Rescue Team, Lakes Region Search and Rescue, and the Upper Valley Wilderness Response Team departed before daybreak on Thursday, January 18th from Zealand Road to attempt a different access point to the Mount Gio area. The New Hampshire Army National Guard had fortunately gotten better conditions that morning. By 8:30 in the morning, they were able to actually land near the summit of Gio and retrieve the body of Roma. The aerial recovery certainly saved an arduous rescue for the 15 fish and game officers and the 30 volunteers who were already out on the trail approaching the site where Roma had lost his life. For some reason, this story really touched a nerve, and so I began researching it and looking around for any other information that I might be able to find about Chris Roma. I came across an Instagram post by a hiker who happened to be parked 2 spaces over when Chris Roma pulled in to begin his hike of the Pemi Loop. Corey Birdfeeder Perkins wrote that he had learned Roma had countless extremely impressive hiking achievements, such as a Direttissima last October. A Direttissima is when a hiker sets out and hikes all 48 of the 4,000 footers of New Hampshire in one fell swoop. For Perkins, he wrote, "This one hit different for the entire community. It could have been any one of us. This could have been your favorite hiking influencer. This could have been your closest hiking partners. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, this could have been me." Sobering words for sure. And then on this YouTube channel, on Everest Mystery, I got a comment from a subscriber. His username is Sector SOS, and he was out on the trail on a 3-day hiking trip with his wife at the time that Chris Roma lost his life. He writes, "The weather was treacherous that day. We actually received an alert about a missing hiker and learned about the rescue efforts from the New Hampshire Search and Rescue Team, but it wasn't until we got back home when I learned about his untimely and unfortunate passing." After I saw this comment, I commented back and said, "Can you give me any information about the conditions that day?" I was trying to extrapolate and find as much as I could about what might have happened to Chris Roma on that day, why he didn't turn around or at least pack some extra gear in his bag. And Sector SOS wrote back to me, Weather on that specific day deteriorated very rapidly. It started off as breezy, but a very clear day. New Hampshire Fish and Game commissioners actually put out a warning about a significant temperature drop, possible snow clouds rolling in later in the day. Since we were doing a 3-day hike, we were prepared very well. We had geolocation trackers, snowshoes, crampons, tent, and sleeping bags. At about 10 a.m., the weather started to deteriorate rapidly. So now this would be 6 hours into Chris Roma's hike. Temperatures dropped significantly, snow and wind picked up drastically. With the wind gusts, the temperature dropped to single digits. And this is the most incredible thing. He said visibility deteriorated to not more than an arm length in front of you. With the wind gusts and heavy snowfall, the depths of snow sometime would get to waist deep or deeper. It was extremely cold, frigid temperatures with wind gusts, reduced visibility almost to zero. But because we were preparing for this hike and for winter blizzard-like conditions for some time, me and my wife were somewhat prepared. However, I cannot imagine what it would be like if you were caught off guard just on your simple long-distance trail hike. The blizzard subsided only by the evening the next day. We didn't find out about Christopher's death until we came back home almost 4 days later. Christopher Roma ran a company called Northeast Trekking Company. He spent much of his life endeavoring to inspire others to find the transformative experience in nature that had transformed his very own life. He was an inspirational character. Many people met him. My own wife met him about 1.5 years ago, not too long before she was endeavoring to do a section of the Pacific Crest Trail out near California. In her long conversation with Chris Roma, he convinced her to change the section that she was hiking in, something she's very thankful for due to some information and intel on the trail saying if you're going to do a hike, this is the place to be. She did follow his advice. The one thing that she remembers him saying is, the trail will provide. On his website, it says, I experienced a lot of learning the hard way, and my goal is to educate and inform you about the dangers of the wild, the trials and tribulations, and the importance of sustainability. I want to show you that if we take care of nature, nature will take care of us mentally and physically, the website says. And in a video posted by the Associated Press, Roma's mother said Christopher was always wanting to achieve more. He loved his family and enjoyed hiking with his 2-year-old son. So now for my analysis, if you will, of these circumstances. Certainly, it's a most unfortunate thing that took place. There's no doubt in my mind that Chris Roma had more experience than just about anybody I know. I do know a lot of Pacific Crest Trail and thru-hikers, Triple Crowners actually. One of my first experiences with a Triple Crown hiker was filming Flyin' Brian Robinson, who some 20 some odd years ago became the first person to do all the long trails of the United States in a single calendar year. It was my job to film a short video segment for National Geographic Television on the final day of his third thru hike going up Katahdin in Maine. It was absolutely phenomenal. And the one thing that I was left with in that experience of working with for one day Flyin' Brian Robinson is thru-hikers are notoriously light packers. They pack as little as absolutely necessary so as to make their body less likely to be burdened by things that they don't really need. Here's a case in point. My wife, who went on the Pacific Crest Trail about a year ago, bumped into a thru-hiker there. His name was Water Baby. That's his trail name. He didn't even have a tent or sleeping bag and would just sleep on the ground. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. He was fine. But he also did have enough to carry a squirt gun, and he would always squirt people with the water. Just a very joyful individual that she said left a very positive impression on her life. But she was mind-boggled that there would be a person without even the lightest tent. Now, some of these lightweight tents only weigh 3 pounds. Really, really sturdy tents. And a sleeping bag, a light sleeping bag, might only weigh a pound or so. So to me, it seems that Chris Roma is an example of a person who might have gotten in a little bit too far into something without having the ability to get himself out. As happens on so many situations like this, it's not one big mistake or improper decision. It's the accumulation of multiple small decisions that add up and ultimately lead to, say, an avalanche or being too far to get yourself out of trouble. And also in this day and age of social media where people do what they call spray, they spray out their accomplishments on social media so everybody can marvel at what they did. It's amazing how much give and take there is at people trying to accomplish certain things. The Ultra 8, for instance, there's something that I just learned about today called the terrifying 25. 25 really difficult hikes that are apparently terrifying. But now what happens is people do things called the grid, where they want to hike all 48 4,000 footers in every single month of the year. So when you're endeavoring to do that and you only have so many days in, say, the month of January, you just have to go when you have to go. When Chris Roma set out to do the Pemi Loop on January 16th, he was very possibly hiking with thru-hiker mentality. I spoke to Lieutenant Jim Nealand, who was the officer who wrote the New Hampshire Fish and Game report that I first read about when I learned of Chris's death. That he said when they recovered the body, there were no snowshoes at the site, and that since there was no backpack taken down with him, it's unknown whether there was a sleeping bag or light tent or any other gear that might help him keep warm, such as a stove to create a hot cup of cocoa or something like that. The plain fact is, when nature rears its ugly head, even the most prepared people can get themselves in a lot of trouble unless they are ready to hunker down. I learned to hike in the wintertime with my brother Jeff. He was the first one who ever took me out there and showed me the ropes. And he always said it's worth putting an extra 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 pounds in your pack, which to a thru hiker is absurd. These guys are hiking with 10 or 12 or 14 pound packs. But as my brother said, an extra thermal layer, a fleece like this, or a sleeping bag, a real light sleeping bag, or even an extra layer called a bivy sack that you can crawl into is the most important piece of equipment that you hope you will never have to use. Sometimes that might be an extra hat or hand warmers that you take out, that you rip open in those little plastic packs and put them in your pockets to keep you warm. Lieutenant Jim Nealand, the New Hampshire Fish and Game officer that I spoke with, had a lot of things to say about hiking in the winter or any time of year for that matter. And he said one thing that you always want to do is prepare accordingly for the conditions that you might encounter along the way. Mount Washington, the home of the world's worst weather, especially during the month of January, can offer anything. So some extra equipment would be advisable to anybody considering going out. Check the weather forecast well in advance, and if the weather is something that doesn't interest you, wait for another day. It's always going to be there. Lieutenant Nealand also suggests that very rarely are these rescues taking place when multiple climbers go out together on a trail. It's usually an individual who is hiking alone, not able to check and balance with one another about certain conditions, and when you think about when a climber or hiker gets really cold, they begin making different kinds of decisions. They're not thinking clearly, their body starts to shiver and shake in order to keep warm, and then their mental faculties are definitely not at 100%. Lieutenant Nealon suggested that any hiker interested in going out into the mountains, whether winter or summer, visit a website called hikesafe.com. It has a hiker code with the responsibilities for yourself and how to best be prepared with knowledge and gear. Among other things, he talked about the code, about when to turn back, about the equipment that one would need to pack, and talked about the importance of self-reliance, learning about terrain and conditions, which Chris Roma certainly did have a knowledge of, but perhaps given the fact that maybe he'd never been turned back before in the face of bad conditions or poor weather, and just thought, if I keep moving fast enough, maybe I'll make it. Listen, I'm not making any judgment here. I've been there before. I've gotten myself into very tricky situations. On Mount Washington alone, I've been in an avalanche and almost lost my life. 3 of my friends came perilously close to losing their lives. So I understand how things go up there. I'll share in the notes to this video a link for the Hike Safe card, which is a card that hikers can buy that has the code of responsibility, but the money that you pay for it, I think it's $25 a year, goes to support the rescue efforts of the New Hampshire Fish and Game and search and rescue organizations throughout New Hampshire and the White Mountains. There's also a GoFundMe page for the family of Chris Roma. As I said earlier, he had a 2-year-old son who will dearly miss his dad and the passion and the knowledge of his dad. And so I'll put a link to that as well in the notes to this video. I truly welcome your comments and hope that you'll take the time to share your thoughts on this. And again, for friends or relatives of Chris Roma, this is in no way an indictment of Chris himself, but hopefully a cautionary tale for other climbers endeavoring to go out and do hikes that might be a little bit bigger than perhaps they think they can handle, and people who should at least take heed that bad things can and will happen out in the wilderness. A statement in the online fundraiser set up by Chris Roma's friends, it says, "While his family and friends are devastated by his loss, we find comfort knowing that he died doing what he loved." Chris Roma's trail name, a moniker that hikers use to refer to one another on through hikes and in long treks, was Rafiki. He had completed the arduous Triple Crown of hiking, as I had mentioned earlier, and his name Rafiki refers to the character in The Lion King, the mandrill who was the wise sage, which Chris certainly fashioned himself to be. Hopefully, in his passing, we can continue to learn from the experiences of Christopher Roma. May his family and friends be well. If you've enjoyed this video, I hope you'll take a moment not only to subscribe and hit the bell button so you're notified of future videos like this, but take a moment to comment in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your insights, and any stories that you might have to share about your experiences of near misses in the wilderness and the outdoors. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. I'll be back with another story like this for you in the next week or so. Make the world a better place. Look out for one another. Do a kind deed and don't look for anything in return. Make the world a better place one day at a time. Be well, my friends.